Hi everyone, I'm Vignesh Sivakumar from Phoenix Financial Training, here to share a few tips relevant to the Advanced Financial Management exam that some of you may be walking into in the next week or so. The exam that you'll be going into will have 3 questions, 1 question of 50 marks and 2 questions of 25 marks. Nearly half the exam is discursive, with the other half being numerical elements. Often the discursive elements tend to be based on numbers that you have calculated, but you do tend to have independent theory questions asked as well. The exam is paper-based or computer-based depending on where you are in the world. So many of you may be taking traditional paper-based exams, but in some countries affected by COVID-19 or ones where the ACCA have already implemented computer-based exams, you'll be taking this exam in Excel and Word within the ACCA platform. Moving on to key areas on AFM, investment appraisal is a commonly examined area on AFM. You can expect questions asking you to do a basic NPV computation with a few complex adjustments, which could include financing adjustments relating to adjusted present value computations where a project is specifically financed. You may also be given an NPV and asked to advise on the viability of the project based on certain add-on calculations and discussion on areas like sensitivity, or by calculating the MIRR, the duration of a project. Often questions on investment appraisal, basic NPV questions, tend to have an add-on in the form of Black-Scholes option pricing, a valuation of real options such as an option to expand or an option to abandon. So you need to be able to perform the computations and then advise the company on whether the option makes the project worthwhile pursuing or not. Yet another important area that you tend to see almost every single time in the exam is mergers and acquisitions. This is where you could be asked to value companies. Often questions are set in the context of mergers, demergers, some sort of restructuring, and you're asked to value the individual companies as well as the combined company, and then discuss as well as show mathematically the gains to the shareholders of the individual companies, to the acquirer, to the target of going in for that merger or acquisition or demerger. So you effectively have to compare what we had before with what we had after, look at the gains, comment on whether this would be acceptable to the shareholders of the constituent companies. Independent theory questions linked to the same area may include wanting you to discuss certain regulatory aspects such as squeeze-out rights and the principle of fair treatment, as well as the concept of synergy and difficulties associating with realizing synergies. Mergers and acquisition many a time is connected with the area of cost of capital. So when you're doing valuation or using methods like free cash flow method, you do need to calculate the cost of capital relevant to that valuation, taking into account the relevant business risk. And for that, you need to have a thorough understanding of how you get to the relevant cost of equity, use that in getting to the cost of capital where necessary. This may require certain adjustments to business risk, which you're able to bring in by working very cleverly with the beta values given. The capital asset pricing model is probably the most commonly used method for getting to cost of equity, and it lends a very good area to be for examining you on how you work with beta. So make sure you're really well prepared on that area. Insofar as the cost of debt is concerned, which is yet another component of cost of capital, you may be asked to calculate the cost of debt of a redeemable bond through IRR. But sometimes you're also given the risk-free rate credit spreads, and then it's a pretty straightforward process of adding them up depending on the credit rating of the company, getting to the KD, and then including that in your WACC computation. You may also get discursive questions in the area of financing methods or sources of finance. The examiner may give you a few sources, ask you to discuss what you think about those sources, or alternatively give you a problem and say, how do you think we should be financing? What are the factors we should be considering when we are raising finance in the company in the given circumstance? And a lot of exam questions give you a template for the kind of things the examiner can ask you in this area. Risk management is a guaranteed question in the exam. So you could get a question on interest rate risk or foreign exchange risk. You need to be very well prepared with some of those complex derivative instruments such as futures, options, in the context of forex risk. In the case of interest rate risk, you need to be really thorough with futures, option, collar, FRA, as well as interest rate swaps. You may be asked a few discursive questions on the areas of advantages, disadvantages of these instruments, why exchange traded instruments, concept of basis risk, concept of margin money and maintenance margin. So make sure you're thorough with those ideas, and also be comfortable with addressing a more generic question where you could be given some genuine business risks and be asked to comment on how would you manage that risk. You may choose to reduce the risk or avoid the risk or transfer the risk. So you need to be prepared to take a step back from those calculations and think broader and advise the company on how you would manage certain risks. And a lot of that response comes from adopting a common sense approach to responding to these questions. Besides these core areas, there will always be bits and pieces of other areas that gets tested, which may include quite a bit of marks allotted for forecasting financial performance, forecasting an SOFP, an income statement. You may sometimes be asked to do a small little dividend capacity calculation or evaluate the dividend policy of the company. Occasionally, you have a traditional ratio analysis question where you have to look at the past financial performance and do some ratios, comment on how well the company is performing. You may again get small theory questions on other areas which form part of AFM, such as Islamic finance, behavioral finance, treasury related questions, where you need to have an appreciation of what treasury do, whether centralization is better, decentralization is better. So you will always have questions on these areas, which will not be a huge amount of marks, but will be somewhere between 6 and 8 marks. And often just having an understanding and then trying to use some of the question info to expand on these points will fetch you really, really good marks in the exam. So these are some of the key areas that I would strongly advise you to look at through past exam questions. Now, after looking at all the knowledge elements, it's even more important to try and emphasize certain key contributors to your success in the exam. The first of which is meticulous time management. AFM is a very time pressured exam, and it is super important that you stick to your time allocation on each part of each question so that you're able to make a decent attempt on all parts. Now, given the time pressure, it is obviously unlikely that you will be able to do perfect answers to all questions. However, by spreading your time out, you're able to provide your attention and focus distributed evenly across all the parts. And this is one of the examiners' comments constantly, that candidates focus far too much on the numbers or the wordy bits. By meticulous time management, you will avoid that and be able to spread your time evenly across the various questions and thereby score a decent bit of marks on both the numerical elements as well as the discursive elements. And with the numerical elements, you will observe that there are a lot of easy marks to grab, while there will be one or two tricks that tend to create problems for you in the exam. It's important that we don't get sucked into that and rather move on. Where we get stuck, we've got to find a way of assuming a number, moving on, interpreting your made up number maybe and commenting on it. And by doing all of that, you get method marks. And doing all of this in an exam context can be quite overwhelming. It is a very, very time pressured environment that you're operating in. And at that time, it's important you don't give up. You persevere and remember that if you keep going and responding and putting a decent answer to all parts of the question, however difficult the exam might be, you're going to be faring much better than the peers in the room or the peers writing exams elsewhere in the world. And therefore, the key is not to get worried about how difficult the exam is, because if it's difficult for you, it's difficult for everybody else. There are quite a lot of technical, challenging elements you will see in AFM, which will represent probably about 20% of the exam. 80% of the exam will be pretty straightforward, but because of the difficulty of the 20% and us getting too distracted by it, there's always a risk that we ignore the remaining 80% and even lose those marks there. And that's a pitfall we've got to avoid. A lot of timed question practice and trying to do 1 or 2 full mock exams like the real exam. Just sit there, do it for 3 hours, 15 minutes. That will help you greatly in managing your adrenaline better inside the exam hall. So with all of these tips and bits of advice, I wish you all the very best, and I do honestly hope your exam goes really, really well. So ace it.